The summer air hung thick over Berlin in 1952, carrying with it the smell of reconstruction and the electric tension of a divided city. In a nondescript office building in the American sector, a small group of intelligence officers gathered around a hand-drawn map, their cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling as they contemplated what would become one of the most daring espionage operations of the Cold War. What they were about to propose seemed impossible, perhaps even insane: to dig a tunnel nearly half a kilometer long directly beneath the Soviet sector of Berlin to tap into the communication lines of their adversaries. The idea was born from desperation and the peculiar logic of the Cold War, where the stakes were nothing less than the future of human civilization. Every scrap of intelligence mattered. Every intercepted communication could mean the difference between peace and nuclear annihilation. And in Berlin, divided like a broken mirror between East and West, the opportunities for gathering such intelligence were both tantalizingly close and frustratingly distant. The man who had championed this audacious plan was William King Harvey, a former FBI agent who had joined the CIA and quickly earned a reputation as someone who got things done. Harvey was a peculiar figure in the refined world of intelligence work. He carried a pistol everywhere, even to meetings at headquarters. He drank heavily. His appearance was more that of a hard-boiled detective than a sophisticated spy. But beneath that rough exterior was a mind that understood the essential truth of espionage, that boldness, when properly calculated, often succeeded where caution failed. Harvey had arrived in Berlin with a mandate to improve American intelligence gathering against the Soviets. The existing methods weren't producing enough.
The CIA needed something more, something that would give them access to the inner workings of Soviet military and intelligence operations. They needed to hear what the enemy was saying when they thought no one was listening. The inspiration came from an operation the British had run in Vienna, where MI6 had successfully tapped Soviet communication lines by digging a small tunnel. When Harvey learned about this, his mind began racing with possibilities. If it could be done in Vienna, why not in Berlin? And why not do it on a scale that would dwarf anything attempted before? But Berlin presented challenges that Vienna hadn't. The city was a pressure cooker of espionage activity. The Soviets were paranoid and vigilant. The East German secret police were developing a reputation for thoroughness that would make them among the most feared in the world. And the distance from the American sector to the most valuable Soviet communication cables was substantially greater than what the British had managed. Harvey didn't care about the obstacles. He saw only the prize. The Soviet landline cables running beneath Berlin carried military communications, KGB traffic, and conversations between Soviet commanders and Moscow. If the CIA could tap those cables, they would have a window into Soviet thinking that no other source could provide. In the nuclear age, understanding Soviet intentions was worth almost any risk. Yet, even as Harvey assembled his team of engineers and intelligence analysts in late 1953, doubt gnawed at him during sleepless nights. The operation was massive, unprecedented in its scope and complexity. One mistake could spark an international crisis. One informant could doom everyone involved. He would lie awake in his apartment, a bottle of whiskey on the nightstand, wondering if he was leading good men into disaster. But by morning, the doubt was always buried beneath determination. The first challenge was finding the right location. After extensive surveying, they identified their target, a cluster of communication cables near the Schoenfelder Chaussee. The cables were located about 1,500 feet inside the Soviet sector. The tunnel would need to be nearly 1,800 feet long to reach them, more than 20 feet underground. For cover, the Americans would construct a radar station in the Rudau district, just inside the American sector. To any Soviet observer, it would appear to be exactly what they claimed: another piece of the air defense network. The installation would explain the construction activity, the power consumption, and the teams of personnel who would need access 24 hours a day. But underground, a different battle was being fought, one carried out in silence, darkness, and fear. The construction of the radar station began in September 1954. To the Soviets watching from across the sector boundary, it looked routine. But beneath it all, in a basement that went deeper than anyone outside the operation knew, the entrance to the tunnel was being prepared. The actual digging began in February 1955. The work proceeded in 8-hour shifts, around the clock. Army engineers who had been carefully screened worked in the most difficult conditions imaginable: confined spaces, poor air quality, constant dampness, and the psychological pressure of knowing they were literally digging beneath enemy territory. The tunnel proceeded horizontally, gradually sloping downward until it reached a depth of about 25 feet. The walls were lined with curved steel segments. A narrow-gauge rail system was installed to move carts of excavated earth back to the entrance.
where it was dispersed inside the radar station building where it couldn't be seen. 3 weeks into the dig, a young engineer named Danny Morrison was working the midnight shift when he heard something that stopped his heart. Voices. Russian voices. Directly above him. He froze, his shovel suspended in midair. The other men in the tunnel saw his face and went silent. They all heard it then. Muffled conversation. The crunch of boots on gravel. A Soviet patrol walking directly over their heads. Morrison looked at the tunnel ceiling, at the thin layer of earth separating them from discovery. If the ground gave way, if the Soviets had detection equipment, if they were conducting some kind of security sweep, he held his breath, waiting. The voices continued for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. Then they faded into the distance. When the patrol was gone, Morrison realized his hands were shaking. The crew chief ordered a 15-minute break. Several men lit cigarettes with trembling fingers. No one spoke about what had just happened, but everyone understood how close they had come to disaster. That night, Morrison wrote a letter to his wife that he would never send, explaining what he was really doing in Berlin. He sealed it and kept it with his personal effects, just in case. Meanwhile, across the city, another drama was unfolding, one that would ultimately seal the tunnel's fate. George Blake sat in a cafe in the British sector, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a British intelligence officer, enjoying a quiet afternoon. But his mind was racing. He had just learned full details about the tunnel operation through his position in MI6, which was partnering with the CIA on the project. That evening, Blake took his usual walk through the Tiergarten. Near a specific bench, he paused to tie his shoe. A signal. 20 minutes later, he was sitting in the back of a car with darkened windows, speaking rapidly in Russian to his KGB handler. "They're calling it Operation Gold," Blake said, spreading out the details he had memorized. "The tunnel will be 1,800 feet long. They're targeting the cables near Schonefelder Chaussee. They've already begun construction." His handler, a man named Korovin, listened with an expression that Blake couldn't read. When Blake finished, Korovin was silent for a long moment. "This information will be reported to Moscow," Korovin finally said. "You will continue to provide updates. But, George, you must be extraordinarily careful. This is exactly the kind of intelligence that will make the Americans hunt for a mole if they suspect compromise." Blake nodded, but inside he felt the familiar mixture of exhilaration and dread that came with betrayal. He was saving the world from capitalist imperialism, he told himself. He was on the right side of history. But sometimes, in quiet moments, he wondered if he was simply a traitor who had found an ideology to justify his treachery. As Blake returned to the British sector that night, he didn't know that he had just set in motion one of the most bizarre situations in espionage history. The KGB now faced an extraordinary dilemma. They knew about the tunnel, but they couldn't simply shut it down without revealing their source inside British intelligence. Blake was too valuable to burn. In Moscow, KGB leadership debated for days. Some argued for exposing the tunnel immediately. Others insisted that Blake's intelligence was worth more than preventing one American operation. Finally, a decision was made. Let the tunnel proceed, but carefully control what intelligence flowed through the cables it would tap. But implementing this proved more difficult than anticipated. The landline cables carried enormous volumes of traffic from multiple Soviet and East German agencies. Redirecting sensitive communications without creating suspicious patterns was nearly impossible. The KGB settled for a middle strategy. Allow most communications to continue normally, steer the most sensitive information elsewhere when possible, and occasionally feed specific disinformation through the tapped lines. While this chess game played out at the highest levels of Soviet intelligence, the tunnel crew continued their work, unaware that their enemy knew exactly what they were doing. By April 1955, the tunnel had crossed beneath the sector boundary and was proceeding into Soviet-controlled territory. The psychological impact on the crew was profound. Several men requested transfers, others developed nervous habits, checking their watches compulsively, starting at sudden sounds. The tunnel's atmosphere grew heavier with each foot they advanced into enemy territory. Harvey visited the tunnel regularly, descending into the earth to check on progress and morale. He would stand in the cramped space, watching the men work, and feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him like the thousands of tons of soil above their heads.
At night, the doubts returned. Was he sending these men to their deaths? Was the intelligence worth the risk? What if the Soviets were already watching, waiting to spring a trap? But each morning, he buried the doubt and pushed forward. That's what leadership meant in this business, carrying fear you couldn't share and making decisions that might be wrong but couldn't be unmade. The tunnel advanced at about 15 feet per day. The workers developed a rhythm, a system that allowed them to maximize progress while minimizing risk. They worked in near silence, communicating with hand signals. The only sounds were the soft scrape of tools and the rumble of cartwheels on rails. Above ground, the radar station appeared normal. Personnel came and went in military vehicles. The antenna arrays rotated, tracking aircraft. To Soviet observers across the sector boundary, nothing seemed amiss. In late February 1956, nearly a year after digging began, the tunnel crew reached the target location. They were now directly beneath the Soviet communication cables. A vertical shaft was carefully excavated upward. When they judged they were within inches of the cables, they brought down electromagnetic sensors. The detection equipment confirmed the presence of the cables directly above. After burrowing more than 1,800 feet through unstable soil, they had emerged exactly where they needed to be. Communications technicians took over, working in the cramped vertical shaft to position induction coils around the cables. The installation took several days. Every connection had to be perfect. The technicians worked in shifts, lying on their backs in the narrow shaft, reaching up to work on the cables above them, knowing that if they were discovered, there would be no escape.
But the work proceeded without incident. By late February 1956, the taps were in place and operational. Signals began flowing back through the tunnel to recording equipment on the radar station. Magnetic tape machines rolled continuously, capturing hundreds of hours of Soviet communications. The initial results seemed to justify every risk taken. The tapes captured Soviet military communications about troop movements and operational planning. There were KGB communications about espionage operations. There were technical discussions about weapons systems. The volume was staggering, hundreds of conversations per day across multiple channels. The CIA established a major processing operation. Teams of translators worked around the clock, transcribing conversations from Russian and German into English. Analysts evaluated each conversation, building up a comprehensive picture of Soviet military operations in East Germany. Within weeks, the tunnel was producing more intelligence than any other single source. Harvey allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The operation was working. Against all odds, against the doubts and the risks, they had achieved something extraordinary. What none of them knew was that in Moscow, KGB officers were reviewing the same conversations, calculating what the Americans were learning and waiting for the right moment to shut it all down. The tunnel operated successfully for nearly a year. Every day, the tapes rolled. Every day, analysts extracted intelligence that informed American policy and military planning throughout 1956. But the Soviets were patient, watching and waiting for an opportunity that would allow them to discover the tunnel without compromising Blake. It came on April 21, 1956. Heavy rains had been falling on Berlin for days. Groundwater was rising throughout the city. Soviet telephone technicians were conducting routine maintenance on the landline network, checking for water damage. When a repair crew was dispatched to investigate a problem near the Schonenfelder Chaussee, they discovered something extraordinary.
The crew chief, a man named Anatoly Petrov, was checking cable junctions when he noticed something unusual in the soil, a depression that hadn't been there before. He began digging, expecting to find a collapsed drainage pipe. Instead, his shovel struck metal. Within minutes, they had exposed a steel chamber with sophisticated equipment attached to their communication cables. Petrov stood staring at it, understanding slowly dawning. He looked at the tunnel entrance shaft, at the cables, at the equipment. Americans. It had to be Americans. He sent his men running for their supervisor while he stood guard over the discovery, his heart pounding. Within hours, Soviet military commanders arrived, then KGB officers. They excavated around the chamber, exposing the tunnel entrance shaft. They followed the tunnel back toward the American sector with flashlights and weapons drawn, discovering the full scope of the operation. The KGB officers who descended into the tunnel that day couldn't help but be impressed by the technical sophistication, even though they had known about its existence all along. The American engineers had done remarkable work, but now the operation was over, and the Soviets had to decide how to exploit the discovery. On April 23, 1956, the Soviet military commander in Berlin called the press conference. Western journalists were invited to tour the tunnel. The Soviets presented it as evidence of American treachery, filmed extensively, and expressed outrage. The propaganda machinery went into full operation.
When news of the discovery reached Washington, Harvey sat alone in his office, staring at the cable from Berlin. The tunnel was exposed. Nearly a year of work, millions of dollars, enormous risks, all seemingly for nothing. He poured himself a drink and tried to calculate the damage. How much had they learned? How had they been discovered? Was there a mole? The Americans said nothing officially. They neither confirmed nor denied the tunnel's existence. But privately, intelligence officials were devastated. Their most productive intelligence source in Berlin was gone, and they had no way of knowing how much damage the exposure had done. Yet, in the months that followed, as analysts continued working through the backlog of recorded communications, a different picture emerged.
The intelligence gathered during those 11 months was genuine and valuable. Despite the KGB's attempts to control information flow, the sheer volume of traffic had meant that plenty of useful intelligence was captured. The tunnel had worked, even while compromised. The truth about Blake wouldn't emerge until 1961, when a Polish defector provided information that led to his identification as a Soviet agent. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 42 years in prison, the longest sentence ever handed down by a British court. He would later escape and flee to the Soviet Union, but by then, the tunnel he had betrayed had become legendary. For Harvey, the tunnel became his greatest success despite its exposure. It was recognized as a masterpiece of operational planning and execution. His willingness to take calculated risks had produced one of the most significant intelligence coups of the Cold War. The operation demonstrated that boldness could succeed, that technical intelligence could produce results human sources couldn't match, and that even compromised operations could generate valuable intelligence. The men who built that tunnel carried the secret for years. The engineers who dug it could never speak publicly about what they had done, but among themselves and within the classified world, they were legends. Danny Morrison, the young engineer who had frozen in terror when Soviet voices passed overhead, would tell his children decades later that he had worked on construction projects in Berlin. He never mentioned the tunnel, even after it was declassified. Some secrets became part of who you were, too deep to share, even when permission was granted. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and Germany was reunified, historians became interested in rediscovering the tunnel. Parts of it were excavated and preserved. A museum was established near the site. Visitors can now see exhibits about the operation, including equipment that was used and photographs from the construction. The tunnel has become part of Berlin's Cold War heritage, a reminder of the extraordinary lengths to which intelligence services went during that period.
The story resonates because it captures something essential about the Cold War, an era when the stakes were existential, when nuclear annihilation hung over every decision, when intelligence services believed any risk was justified. The men who conceived and executed the tunnel genuinely believed they were protecting the free world. They saw their work as essential to preventing World War III, but it also illustrated the ambiguities of espionage. The tunnel was compromised from the beginning, yet it produced valuable intelligence. The Soviets knew but let it operate to protect Blake, but that decision may have cost them more than shutting it down. The Americans thought they had achieved unprecedented success, unaware their enemy had known all along. Reality in the world of espionage was always more complex than it appeared. In the final analysis, was the Berlin Tunnel worth the risk? The operation was expensive and risky. When discovered, it provided the Soviets with a propaganda victory, but it also produced genuine intelligence value. The Americans learned an enormous amount about Soviet military operations. They demonstrated a capability that made the Soviets more cautious about using landline communications, forcing them to adopt more expensive security measures. More importantly, the operation had a psychological impact within the intelligence community. It showed that the CIA could conceive and execute complex technical operations successfully. It built confidence and expertise applied to other operations. It created a legacy that influenced the CIA for decades afterward. For the individuals involved, the tunnel was often the defining experience of their careers. The engineers became legends. The analysts built careers on their expertise. The officers who planned it carried lessons about what was possible when boldness met careful planning. The Berlin Tunnel was a product of its time, reflecting the fears, ambitions, and capabilities of the early Cold War. It couldn't happen today in the same way because the world has changed too much. But the impulse behind it, The desire to know what the enemy is thinking remains as strong as ever. Intelligence services still conduct audacious operations.
They still take calculated risks. They still ask ordinary people to do extraordinary things. The tunnel under Berlin was one chapter in that ongoing story. It was a moment when creativity, engineering skill, and operational daring came together to achieve something remarkable. It was flawed, compromised, and ultimately exposed. But it worked. For 11 months, American intelligence officers listened to their adversaries, gathered valuable information, and felt they were making a difference in the great struggle of their time. The men who built that tunnel are mostly gone now. Their work is declassified, studied by historians, displayed in museums. But the spirit that animated it, the belief that cleverness and courage could make a difference in the defense of freedom, still resonates. It reminds us that in the shadows of history, ordinary people doing extraordinary things shaped the world we inherited. The Berlin Tunnel was their monument, dug in secret beneath a divided city. And though the Cold War has ended, its story continues to fascinate, because it reveals something true about human ingenuity, determination, and the eternal struggle between secrecy and revelation that defines the world of espionage.